Hangover Part 2. Have you seen the first one? Because if you've seen the first one, you have seen this movie. I've never seen a sequel that so blatantly copies and clones exactly the first movie. I mean, it's almost immediately apparent at the very beginning of the movie that they're going to give you the exact same formula as the first one. It starts off exactly the same way with a marriage or a wedding ceremony being prepared over a slow motion montage with classical wedding theme music, and over that you hear people calling a bunch of characters' cell phones, Ed Helms and Zach Galifianakis in this instance, and then Phil calls up and says, "Yeah, we fucked up." But in this one, it's the exact same setup, except he says, "We fucked up really bad because this is the sequel, and we're supposed to fuck up even more than the first one." So, The Hangover Part 2 is such, it's such, it's hard for me to really think of a way to criticize it because it's so incredibly similar to the first one that I feel to criticize it in any way would be to say that I'm criticizing the first one. I mean, that's how closely it sticks to the formula of the first one, is that it's almost pretty much the same movie, just set in Bangkok, and instead of a baby, there's a monkey this time, and except there's a lot more of the gangster Chow in this movie, Leslie Chow. And there's a lot more Zach Galifianakis awkward, bumbling one-liners that he gives, because obviously he became so popular from the first one. They want to add more of him in this one. So yeah, it's hard for me to really criticize this movie, because I still had a good time. I know that I'm saying that it's such a copy of the first one, but in a weird way that kind of... I know a lot of people sometimes have a problem with that, but when it's only the second chapter, and a movie like this, you can't really expect it to really change up the formula too much because it's such a simple formula, and to really change it up would kind of defeat the purpose of what makes it so special, is that it's so original, and it's almost like a sort of detective story, a bumbling drunken comedic detective story, really, to try and figure out where this missing person is. So it's very interesting in the way that I can't criticize this movie because I would be because even the flaws about this movie are the same flaws from the first one. The woman that Stu is marrying in this movie, we never learn much about her at all, except the fact that her father doesn't very much approve of Stu, and nothing really much else, and that's about it. We don't even figure out how they met. But that was one thing that was sort of a problem in the first one, in that the bride-to-be in that movie, we never learned much about her anyway. So, and that was a little bit of a flaw for both movies. And yet at the same time, it's a flaw that I could look past, because the first one I loved instantly. I loved it. It's one of my favorite comedies of all time. But it's a flaw that you can still ignore because it's not ultimately about the brides. It's about the three guys together and the crazy antics they get into and trying to put the pieces together of their drunken debauchery. And so The Hangover Part 2, it's still funny. It still is funny. It follows step for step. You know exactly what's going to happen. And even in the first one, where Stu plays that song on the piano while they're waiting for the tiger in the bathroom to fall asleep from the sedatives, it's sort of almost like an act break. In the second one, he does the exact same thing with guitar. He makes up an improvised song talking about all the different revelations that they've had about last night. Same thing. And at the end, the way that everything's resolved, with Stu putting pieces together and having it click in his head and finally figuring out where the missing person is. I mean, I could go on and on about all the different sort of bullet points of this movie that very much resemble the first one. So, but yet at the same time, that's a okay thing for me. I don't mind that it's the exact same thing. The one thing that's different about it is the situations that they find themselves in are a lot more crazy and a little bit more darker in a way. So that, I think, was the one way that they managed to make it, a step up from the original, was to make the situations more intensely ridiculous and a little bit more dark. So Hangover Part 2, if you enjoyed the first one, you should enjoy this one, because it is the same exact movie. Not because it's doing something that's even more revolutionary than the first one, or that it's going into, major new territory. You'll like it because it's exactly like the first one. And so, that to me is sort of it's sort of a love-hate relationship when you're viewing this movie, or at least when I viewed it, because I'm thinking, okay, I see that the producers behind this movie and the studios and everyone else just saw that the formula worked, because it was such a surprise success with The Hangover Part 2. And they saw it and they said, we know what works, let's just do it exactly the way we did before, so that at least we're not upsetting people and going in different directions that they don't agree with. Because even if people don't like the movie, we still gave them exactly what they liked the first time. And let's just play it safe. So in that regard, it's sort of like a shameless money grab. It's like, we're just doing the same thing, give us your money, we know you're going to go see it, But at the same time, you still are able to have fun with it, because it still is funny. It still makes you laugh, and that is what is important about a movie like The Hangover Part 2, is the situations need to make you laugh. And that's, to me, what was the greatest thing about The Hangover when I first saw it, was because it was a different comedy. It was different from like the Judd Apatow style of comedy that had been going around for the years previous before it came out, where it's not, characters saying intensely witty or raunchy things, or, that's what I thought Judd Apatow's more like, is his use of wordplay. Whereas The Hangover wasn't necessarily about people saying witty or funny things, although Zach Galifianakis certainly does do that with his awkward one-liners, but it's mostly still about just going from situation to situation, seeing how ridiculous it is, and just seeing these guys just are tortured by all these situations that they have to get into. So, and to be really honest, it's almost sort of like Jackass the movie, but with the plot, because these guys are just getting in these situations that you don't know how they're going to get out of them, and they end up getting humiliated or injured or psychologically damaged. So, The Hangover Part 2, I'd give it a solid B. It is kind of infuriating that I'm just watching the same movie again, and I know how everything is going to go out, how everything's going to play out, so there's nothing really to surprise me. But at the same time, it still is funny. And to say that again and not to sound like a broken record, it still is very, very funny. So I would recommend people who like The Hangover Part 2, or people who like the first Hangover, go see Part 2, because it was a lot of good fun. You're probably, if you were a big fan of the first one, you're going to know exactly what's going to happen. So don't be surprised if you go in and are disappointed because you weren't given anything different. Because you won't. Just accept the fact that it's going to be the same movie you saw before and have fun with it. So, solid B for Hangover Part 2.